old there, isn't it? Yeah, that one goes way. Okay, that figures. I tell you what, that's an old one. And Miss Emma was getting a kick out of that earlier when we was singing through that a little bit there. But sometimes we forget that it's all right to pray for ourselves, isn't it? Not my brother, not my sister, but it's me, oh Lord. And just as we had Brother Kevin do earlier, sometimes we need to come together and pray for our brothers and our sisters and for one another. But sometimes we just need to look and go, Lord, I need it. It's for me. And so hope that encourages your heart this evening. We are going to continue right along just a little short ways from where we left off this morning. We is in 1 Samuel chapter 15. Let's jump over to 1 Samuel chapter 16, and we're going to jump through a couple of verses. And these are very, very familiar scriptures. So there's one good thing about using familiar scriptures. You're familiar with them, all right? Plus, we don't have to spend as long a time trying to digest it, do we? So you follow right along, and you take it all in, and we'll move right on through this evening. Let's just start right off in chapter 16 in verse 1. And the Lord said unto Samuel, How long wilt thou mourn for Saul, seeing I have rejected him from reigning over Israel? Fill thine horn with oil, and go. I will send thee to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided me a king among his sons. So in other words, we find here that Samuel had just kind of mourned himself really bad because he really loved Saul. And as we found out this morning, Saul disobeyed. Saul just wouldn't do what he was told to do because he feared the people was his biggest problem. And so the Lord said, because you've chosen not to obey what I've told you to do, then I can't use you. You will not be the next king. And he's replacing him. And that's just tore poor old Samuel all to pieces. But the Lord says, okay, that's enough. That's enough whining about it. That's enough worrying about it. Don't, get beyond it. He's being replaced. So you fill up the horn with oil, and I'm going to send you to Jesse's house. And one of his sons is fixing to be anointed. So God's just looking at him and saying, go do what I'm telling you to do. Sometimes we get to thinking that there's a place that comes in life that, we reach an importance and stuff, and we say, boy, it'd be hard to replace me, I used to work with a fella that he said, you want to know how hard it'd be to replace you? He said, let me give you a little experiment. He said, fill you about a 5-gallon bucket full of water. And he said, now stick your hand all the way down in that bucket up to your elbow and pull it out and see how big of a hole it leaves. It don't leave much of a hole, does it? Fills right in just as soon as your arm comes out. He says, that's how hard it would be to replace somebody. He said, I know there's a lot of things where if we have to replace folks and stuff, we really miss them. And we grieve and we worry and things like that. But, I find so many people that absolutely just pour their whole life and their whole existence. They ignore their children, their wives, their families, everything around their church, all for that all-precious job. And I can promise you, if you fell dead tonight, they'd be hunting your replacement tomorrow afternoon. But we think our jobs sometimes are so vital to us and so important. And I know we have to have our jobs, and those things are important. But why give up so many important things for things that they just replace you the very next day and never give it another thought? There'd be some of your co-workers that would look and go, man, I miss them. Man, I enjoyed working with them. But for the most part, the company would go right along, wouldn't it? And, so we don't ever need to get to thinking that, boy, God just couldn't do without me, because I can assure you His work will go on without me. It will go on without you, without any of us. But we find there that the Lord is saying, hey, go do what I've told you to do. King Saul's time is over. We're replacing him. Okay? So let's look on down through our verse 2 through 5. We'll read a lot of scriptures, but like I say, most of it's familiar and self-explanatory. And Samuel said, "How can I go? If Saul hear it, he'll kill me." And the Lord said, "Take a heifer with thee, and say, I've come to sacrifice to the Lord. And call Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show thee what thou shalt do. And thou shalt anoint unto me him whom I name unto you." Verse 4 says, "And Samuel did that which the Lord spake. And he came to Bethlehem, and the elders of the town trembled at his coming and said, Comest thou peaceable? Verse 5 says, "And he said, Peaceably, I am come to sacrifice unto the Lord. Sanctify yourselves and come with me to the sacrifice." And he sanctified Jesse and his sons, and he called them to the sacrifice. Verse 6 says, "And it came to pass when they were come that he looked on Eliah and said, Surely the Lord's anointed is before me." So we find here that as Samuel was coming and talking to Jesse, and he said, "Hey, I want to see all your sons. I want to see, one of them is going to be anointed king. I've been sent here to anoint one of these boys king." And the first one walks in and must have been a pretty impressive sight, because the first thing that he said was, "Wow, surely this is him. Man, he just looks like a king." Don't really tell us much about his countenance or what he looked like, but we know that just by this response that he goes, "Surely that's it. Right there he is." You might look at leaders of our countries, or, you might look at folks that are running for office or whatever, and you might just look and go, "Wow, boy, don't he just look like a president? My goodness, he looks like John Kennedy." But then they might open their mouth and you say, "He couldn't get in out of the rain." Sometimes our looks can be deceiving, can't it? We find here that they were looking for a king, and he said, "This is it. Surely, that's him." But no, that was not the case. Because verse 7 said, "But the Lord said unto Samuel, Look not on his countenance, or on the height of his stature, because I have refused him. For the Lord seeth not as man seeth, for man looketh on the outward appearance, but the Lord looketh on the heart." So we find here, that him just saying, "Look not upon his height." So he must have been a strapping, tall young man. And I'm just imagining he was probably very muscular built, very strong, and just had that kingly appearance, And the Lord said, No, that ain't him. Don't look at his countenance. Don't look at how he's built. Don't look at how strong he may appear, because God is going to look on the heart. If we look on down at verses 8 through 10, says, "Then Jesse called Abinadab and made him pass before Samuel, and he said, Nope, neither hath the Lord chosen this one. Then Jesse made Shammah to pass by, and he said, Neither hath the Lord chosen this one. Again Jesse made 7 of his sons to pass before Samuel, and Samuel said unto Jesse, The Lord has not chosen these." Could you imagine what must be going through his mind as he's sitting here looking at one son after another son after another son? And especially for Jesse, because he knows what his sons are like. Nobody probably knows the sons any better than the mothers and the fathers. And, Jesse's probably got in his mind himself of, I bet I know which one's going to be the next king. Maybe it wasn't the first one that looks so strong and manly and kingly, but I bet I know which one it was. And then all of a sudden 7 of them have gone by, and the prophet still looks and goes, No, that's not it. Verse 11, Samuel said to Jesse, "Are here all thy children?" And he said, "Well, there remaineth yet the youngest. Behold, he keepeth the sheep." And Samuel said to Jesse, "Send, fetch him, for we will not sit down until he comes hither." And he sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy and withal of a beautiful countenance, and goodly to look to. And the Lord said, "Arise, anoint him, for this is he." Verse 13 says, Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brethren, and the Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward. So Samuel rose up and went to Ramah. Okay, so here we find, well, do you have any more? Is this it? You not got any more children? Jesse, surely there's more. Well, yeah, there's one more. I've got one more. He's the youngest one. And what was this youngest one doing? He was keeping the sheep. Probably something that to folks in those days would not be looked at as a really glorious job. Not something that you would look at and go, boy, he's among him and his 7 brothers, he's up there. He's looked at highly. He's elevated. No, number one, he was the youngest. And number two, he had what was probably considered a fairly lowly job of out just keeping an eye on the sheep, keeping watch over them. But we find in verse 12 when he comes, said that he was ruddy and of a great countenance. In other words, he was dark complected, dark skinned. And if you look back to what some of those other words mean, they really emphasize on his eyes. They say that David just had beautiful eyes. It was just kind of like captivating and goodly to look at. In other words, David pretty much had it all going on, didn't he, as far as being a good-looking young man. And as soon as he passed by, he looked and said, that's him. That's your next king. You know, but when we find as far as what David was doing that day, he wasn't showing forth a lot of authority. He wasn't showing forth a lot of prestige or a lot of importance in the things he was doing. And I just wonder if tonight, maybe you may feel that way in your Christian life. You look at the things that you do here at the church or the things that you do to serve the Lord, and you go, you know what? I've never got to stand before the church and give my testimony. I've never been asked to stand before the church and share a message from my heart. I've never been asked to sing a solo or do something important or special that you may look at as important. And you say, the things I do here are a little less important. But you know, we find here as David's jobs of tending to the sheep, that sometimes, even though you may look at it as a lowly position that you're doing, this could be preparing you for what God has for you in the future. God may be looking at you and going, I want you to serve me in this way. I want you to be the one that stands out front and waves to the traffic. Or I want you to be someone that stands at the door and says, good morning, it's good to see you. What's that, 5 words? You think, well, how important is that? You know, to someone that's walking into a very strange place that they've never been in, those 5 words could make a world of difference for somebody to look at you and go, good morning, it's good to see you. Wouldn't that just kind of put you at calm and a little bit more at ease of thinking, well, I'm kind of glad I came here to visit this morning. But you know, sometimes we get to looking at things as what an important role it is or what it may serve, and you go, I've never been a teacher, I've never been a deacon, I've never been a leader. But God has something for you. God has something that He can use you to do. And you never know that when that what seems like such a small job and a small position, could God be preparing you for something that's coming up a little further down the road? And we'll see some more about that here in just a minute. You know, the thing that I want us to think about, we talked this morning about obedience, that obedience was better than sacrifice. Did God know that it was David that they were going to anoint? Of course He did. And David could have said to the prophet, hey, go to the house of Jesse, and you find his youngest son, his name's David, and I'm going to anoint him the next king. Would have been that easy, couldn't it? But sometimes God doesn't tell us exactly the end decision, does He? God doesn't tell us exactly where this is going to end up. Sometimes God just says, hey, go do what I'm telling you to do. Just as He told the prophet, hey, go to Jesse's house, call his sons in. I'll tell you which one it is. Step by step by step. He looked at 7 different sons to look, just for God to look and go, nope, that's not him. That's not who I want. That's not the one. Just to get to the youngest, probably the most least likely in Jesse's mind. And just to get to him and to go, that's him. That's your next king right there. You know, sometimes God leads us step by step, little by little. You know, sometimes we may look and go, why didn't God just tell me that in the first place? Well, sometimes there's a lot of reasons. You know, first thing could be that He's teaching us, as we looked at this morning, to be obedient. That God's saying, if you'll take this step, and then I'll tell you to go over here, and then I'll tell you how we're going to do this, and then we'll move on there. But first step is you do what I told you to do first. And then after you get that done, I'll tell you what's the second step. And I'm going to see if you're going to be obedient in what I'm doing. You know, a lot of times if we could look ahead 2 years from now and go, oh, that's the big picture, that's the final outcome. Yeah, Lord, that looks good. I'll do that. But you know, sometimes when the Lord's leading us step by step by step, it takes a whole lot more obedience, doesn't it? To look and go, God, I'll do what you tell me to do. Also takes a whole lot more trust. Maybe God's wanting to put you in there and see just how much do you trust Him. How much do you trust Him to be in control of your life and to lead you in the ways that He has for you? If God just told you what the final outcome was all the time, it doesn't leave a whole lot of room for trusting Him, does it? You'd look and go, yeah, okay, God, I see that. That looks good. I'll just do exactly what you're telling me to do. But sometimes God's wanting to teach us to be obedient, teach us to trust Him. And thirdly, He wants to teach us to have faith in Him. That, you know, when God says, hey, I want you to step out and do this project, and you look and go, Lord, where's the money for that coming from? You know, I remember Pastor Scott talking to us as a staff when they had just a vision in their mind of taking a group to Africa. And he was looking and going, this is going to cost about $30,000. You know, it'd have been a whole lot easier that day if he'd have said, but, you know, God showed us the picture over here that we're going to get money from here and here and here and everything's going to be all right. But no, somewhere someone had to say, let's do it. Let's have faith that God's going to provide that way. And let's step out and trust Him. Let's be obedient if that's what you feel is our leader that God's telling you to do, to take a group to Africa. And guess what? God made a way. God knew it the whole time, didn't He? None of those folks that were going did. They just knew they had to all raise their own money to get there, and they didn't know how it was going to happen. But boy, just piece after piece after piece, God just put it together, worked it out, provided every bit. And, you know, when you can see the end results, that doesn't show how much faith you have in God and how much you're trusting Him and what your obedience may be. But sometimes God's put us in places to saying, do what I'm telling you to do, and one day you will see that it all comes together. I would encourage you to read all of that chapter, but just for time's sake, I want us to jump over to chapter 17. I want us to read a group of verses here. Chapter 17, verse 4, on down through verse 14. It says, and there went out a champion out of the camp of the Philistines named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. And he had a helmet of brass upon his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of brass. And he had greaves of brass upon his legs, and a target of brass between his shoulders, and the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam. And his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron, and one bearing a shield went before him. And he stood and cried to the armies of Israel and said unto them, why are you come out to set your battle in array? Am not I a Philistine, and ye servants to Saul? Choose you a man from you, and let him come down to me. If he be able to fight with me and to kill me, then will we be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then shall ye be our servants and serve us. And the Philistine said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. And when Saul and all of Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Here once again we find Saul, this great leader, as he was this morning, afraid of the people. Now he's greatly afraid of Goliath and of what may lie from behind that. And verse 12 said, Now David was the son of that Ephrathite of Bethlehem, Judah, whose name was Jesse. And he had 8 sons, and the man went among men for an old man in the days of Saul. And the 3 eldest sons of Jesse went and followed Saul to the battle. And the names of his 3 sons that went to the battle were Eliab, the firstborn, and next unto him Abinadab, and the third Shammah. And David was the youngest, and the 3 eldest followed Saul. Verse 15, But David went and returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep in Bethlehem. Where's David at? Once again, he's feeding the sheep. The next ruler, the next king, the one that God has chosen, the one that God has anointed. And here all of his older brothers, or at least 3 of his older brothers, have gone off to face the battle and to face this war that's raging. And it says, and David goes back home to watch the sheep. You know, I'm sure that he might have been wondering in his mind, is this where I'm going to be forever? Am I going to be watching Daddy's sheep for the rest of my life? But you know what? If you look at verse 26 through 28, let's jump over there because, you know, we've already seen how Goliath would come out every day and challenge him. And not just challenge him. In his words, he defied him. He not just came out and gave him a few words to think about. He come out and he was just pretty much a real jerk, wasn't he? I defy you. You think you have a God? I challenge any one of you. I don't care who. Send me the best you got. I'll feed their carcass to the birds of the air. Boy, he was ready to go. He was one that was looking and thinking, there's nothing that can destroy me. Verse 26, that same chapter says, And David spoke to the men that stood by him, saying, What shall be done to the man that kills this Philistine, and taketh away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God? In other words, David's asking these folks standing around, who in the world does he think he is? He's standing out here defying you guys. Not only defying you, he's defying the living God. And we're just standing here letting him. Who does he think he is? Verse 27 says, And the people answered him after this manner, saying, So shall it be done to the man that killeth him. And Eliab, his eldest brother, heard when he spake unto the men, and Eliab's anger was kindled against David. And he said, Why camest thou down hither? And with whom hast thou left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know thy pride and thy naughtiness of thine heart, for thou art come down that thou mightest see the battle. You know, here just like maybe a typical older brother, what are you doing here? Who's watching those few little sheep back in the hillside? You know, once again, kind of putting David to a lower level. That's your job. We're out here. We're the soldiers. We're the ones that need to be out here. And, you know, one thing that I take from that passage of Scripture is sometimes when God calls you to do something and God has a plan for your life, and God, it may be your own family that looks and goes, what are you doing? You really think God could use you to be a messenger? You think God could use you to witness to people? You think God could use you to speak in front of crowds? You think God could use you to sing to large groups of folks? Who do you think you are? His own brother looking, going, I know you. You got that pride in your heart, and you're just being naughty. You're down here doing what you shouldn't be doing when you ought to be back watching those few sheep on the hillside. You know, just that key word there, those few, like even what you're doing is less important. You know, if you was watching 100 sheep, maybe, but you're just there watching just a few little sheep, you know. In other words, his brother telling him, you need to get on back home. But, you know, we find here in just a moment, in verse 33 through 37, when you may think that your job is small, and you may think that what you're doing is unimportant, Let's look at something in David's life right here, and it'll show us that keeping the sheep was preparation for slaying the giant. Boy, when we stop to think that what God has got you to do, when it may seem so insignificant and so little, that God may have you in that job, in that position, because He's preparing you to slay a giant. Look at verse 33. Samuel said to David, "Thou art not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for thou art but a youth, and he a man of war from his youth." Those verses just before that, if you'll read it, this is when David went to the king and he said, "I'll go. I'll fight this giant. Who does he think he is coming against my God? And who does he think he is defying the God of Israel? I'll go and I'll fight him." And not only did his brothers put him down for it, here the very king, not knowing that this is the man that's going to replace him as the next king, but he looks at him and goes, "You're just a kid. This guy has been a warrior from the time he was a kid, and now he's grown. He's been doing this for many years. You can't do this. You can't handle him." And verse 34, let's look at what David's response was there. We can get the pages to come open. And David said unto Saul, "Thy servant kept his father's sheep. And there came a lion and a bear, and took a lamb out of the flock. And I went out after him, and smote him, and delivered it out of the mouth. And when he arose against me, I caught him by his beard, and smote him, and slew him." Verse 36, "Thy servant slew both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be as one of them, seeing he hath defied the armies of the living God." David said, "Moreover, the Lord that delivered me out of the paw of the lion, out of the paw of the bear, He will deliver me out of the hand of this Philistine." And Saul said unto David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." When it comes time to face some of your biggest battles, and he said, "Yeah, I was just a sheep keeper. That's all I've done. But while I was keeping those sheep, God prepared me to face this giant. I had a bear." Folks, you don't want to wrestle with a bear. Believe me, you don't. And if you've ever seen videos and stuff, you know that a lion is one of the most fierce animals you could ever be involved with or around. Not like he grabbed it from a raccoon or something, was it? Said, "I went after both of them, the bear and the lion. I took it out of his paws, and I smote them both. I killed them both while keeping sheep." While he was back doing things that seemed so minor and so unimportant, God was preparing him to slay a giant by having him slay the bear and the lion. Maybe not in such a way of his fighting abilities, but in a way of looking and going, God will take care of me. God will make a way if I will just take that first step and do what He's told me to do. And the reason I know that is because He's done it before. He's done it when I was in these other places and these other things that I was facing. Jump down with me to verse 41. We find there that the Philistine came out and drew near unto David, and the man that bare his shield went before him. And when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, ruddy and of a fair countenance. And the Philistine said unto David, "Am I a dog that thou comest to me with staves?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, "Come to me, and I will give thy flesh unto the fowls of the air, and to the beasts of the field." Then said David to the Philistine, Thou comest to me with a sword and with a spear and with a shield. But I come to thee in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou hast defiled. Verse 46 says, And this day will the Lord deliver thee into my hands, and I will smite thee, take thy head from thee, and I will give the carcasses of the host of the Philistines this day unto the fowls of the air and unto the wild beast. You know, we find the giant was doing some pretty big talking, wasn't he? Some pretty big boasting. And David just came right back to him and said, yeah, you've got all this fancy stuff, your armor bearer, your swords, your weapons, your shields. I come to you in the name of the Lord of God of hosts. That's all I need. And he told him, he said, no, this is the way it is today. This day I will deliver you. I will take your head from you this day and feed your carcass to the fowls of the air. Verse 45 and 46. Let's just look at 46. It says, This day will the Lord deliver thee into my hand, and I will smite thee, and take thy head from thee, and I will give the carcass of the host of Philistines this day unto the fowls of the air, and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. That all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. You know, God may be calling you to do some things today. You know what the rest of the story was. You know David was successful. You know he cut his head off. You know they had victory that day. But you know the whole purpose of it was to show the world that there was a God of Israel. Folks, that's our purpose today, is to show the world that there is a God. We need to be showing this world round about us that there is a God. We believe it, that there is a God. You know, folks, just the fact that people fight things tells us that they know it's true. You have atheists all the time going, there is no God. You're crazy. There is no God. Have you ever heard of an atheist leading a campaign to fight against unicorns or fairies or leprechauns? You know why? Because they know in their heart those things aren't real. So why fight them? If they truly believed in their heart that there is no God, why would you fight it? Why would you go out trying to do research and study and do tests to show that unicorns don't exist? Wouldn't that just be a great big waste of money? Because you know in your heart they don't exist. But these folks that look and go, I'm going to spend every dime I've got and every waking hour I've got to prove that there's not a God. It's because down deep in their heart they know there is a God. They wouldn't be spending all that effort to try to debunk it if they didn't really know that there was. But folks, our purpose needs to be to show this earth, show this world that there is a God. So I just want to encourage you, if you may be right now, if God's got you in a place that seems so unimportant to you, maybe even to your family. You know, look at little David, his brothers. What are you doing? Then the king, you can't do that. And then he gets out there and Goliath looks and goes, you're just a kid. What are you doing? Discouragement on every hand. But he knew that God had his hand on his life and that God had a plan for him. And even though that keeping of the sheep seemed so unimportant, it prepared him for what God had laying ahead of him. Let's pray tonight.